Once upon a time, long before the United States of America was a country, there was a big strip of land along the Atlantic Ocean that was made up of 13 colonies. These colonies were like 13 little brothers and sisters, each with its own personality. There was Virginia with its big farms, Massachusetts with its bustling port cities full of ships, Pennsylvania, where people from all over the world came for a peaceful life, and many more. All of these colonies belonged to a powerful country across the vast ocean, Great Britain. Great Britain was ruled by a king, King George III. For many years, life in the colonies was good. People who lived there, called colonists, felt like they were British citizens, just like the people who lived in London. They were proud of their king and their country. They built towns and cities, farmed the rich land, and raised their families. The king was so far away that he didn't pay too much attention to what they were doing. The colonists mostly made their own rules, elected their own local leaders to make decisions for their towns, and lived with a wonderful sense of freedom. They were creating a new life in a new world, full of opportunity and adventure. They believed they had all the rights and freedoms of any Englishman. But slowly, and then all at once, things began to change. The king across the ocean started to make new rules that the colonists felt were unfair, and it was these unfair rules that would spark the fire of a revolution. The problem all started with money. Great Britain had just finished fighting a long and very expensive war against France. It's called the French and Indian War. The war had been fought to protect the colonies. And now King George and his government, called Parliament, were deep in debt. They needed to raise money, and they looked at the 13 colonies across the ocean and thought they should help pay for it. So Parliament started passing new laws to tax the colonists. The first big one was called the Stamp Act. This law said that colonists had to buy a special stamp for almost every piece of paper they used. Newspapers, calendars, playing cards, legal documents, everything needed a stamp. Imagine if you had to pay extra money just to write a letter to your friend. The colonists were furious. It wasn't just that they had to pay more money. The real problem was that they had no say in the matter. No one from the colonies was in the British Parliament to represent them or to vote on these laws. They started a saying that became their rallying cry: no taxation without representation. It meant it's not fair to make us pay taxes when you don't even let us have a voice in making the rules. They protested, they refused to buy the stamps, and they made their voices heard so loudly that eventually Parliament took back the Stamp Act. The colonists cheered. They thought they had won. But the king and Parliament weren't finished yet. They soon came up with new taxes on things like glass, paint, and, most importantly, on tea. The fight was far from over. The colonists' anger grew with each new tax. To make sure they followed the rules, King George sent thousands of British soldiers to the colonies. The soldiers, who wore bright red coats, were called redcoats, or sometimes lobsterbacks by the colonists. Having soldiers marching through your streets and living in your town made everyone feel tense and nervous. The biggest city for protests was Boston, Massachusetts, and the city was like a pot of water ready to boil over. So on a cold, snowy evening in March of 1770, that pot finally boiled. A small argument started between a colonist and a redcoat soldier who was on guard duty. More people gathered, and soon a crowd of angry colonists surrounded a small group of soldiers. They shouted insults, they threw snowballs, ice, and rocks at the soldiers. The soldiers grew frightened and confused. Their captain ordered them not to fire their muskets, but in the chaos and the noise, someone fired. Then another and another. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. A man named Paul Revere, silversmith and a passionate patriot, created a famous engraving of the event, called it the Bloody Massacre. His picture showed the redcoats firing cruelly into a peaceful, unarmed crowd. While it wasn't exactly what happened, the picture was very powerful. It spread throughout the colonies, and people were horrified. They saw it as proof that the British king was willing to use violence against his own people. The argument had turned into a tragedy, and it pushed the two sides even further apart. The colonists and the British were no longer just disagreeing. They were becoming enemies. Of all the things the British taxed, the colonists were most upset about the tax on tea. Tea was the most popular drink in the colonies. They loved it. To protest the tax, many colonists refused to buy British tea, choosing to smuggle in tea from Holland instead. Seeing this, the British Parliament came up with a new plan. They passed the Tea Act, which made British tea so cheap that it was even cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea. They thought this would trick the colonists into buying the tea and paying the tax. But the colonists weren't fooled. They understood it wasn't about the price of tea. It was about the principle. It was about no taxation without representation. In the winter of 1773, 3 large ships carrying thousands of pounds of British tea sailed into Boston Harbor. The Patriots of Boston, led by a fiery man named Samuel Adams, declared that the tea would not be unloaded. For weeks, the ships sat in the harbor, a tense standoff. Finally, on the cold night of December 16th, the Patriots decided to take action. A large group of men, members of a secret group called the Sons of Liberty, gathered at the Old South Meeting House. Then, in a brilliant move of protest theater, they disguised themselves. They painted their faces, stuck feathers in their hair, and dressed up as Mohawk Native Americans. This was to hide their real identities and to show that they no longer considered themselves British subjects, but something new, Americans. Under the cover of darkness, this group of Mohawks marched silently down to the harbor. They boarded the 3 tea ships, and for the next 3 hours, they worked tirelessly. They hoisted 342 giant heavy chests of tea from the ship's holds and smashed them open with their axes. Then, they dumped every single leaf of tea into the dark, cold waters of Boston Harbor. They didn't steal anything else or damage the ships. It was a protest, a powerful message to the king. We will not be forced to pay your unfair tax. The Boston Tea Party was a bold and defiant act that showed the king that the colonists were not just going to complain anymore. They were ready to fight for their rights. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached King George III in London, he was absolutely furious. He saw it not as a protest, but as an act of rebellion, a direct challenge to his authority. He decided that the colony of Massachusetts, and especially the city of Boston, must be punished severely. So, the British Parliament passed a series of new, harsh laws that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts because they were so awful they simply could not be tolerated. The first act was the Boston Port Act. It closed the entire port of Boston to all ships. No goods could come in, and no goods could go out. This was a devastating blow to the city, which depended on shipping for its survival. People lost their jobs, and families began to worry about how they would get food. Another law took away Massachusetts' right to govern itself, putting it under the direct control of a British general. Yet another law said that British soldiers accused of crimes in the colonies would be sent back to England for their trial, where they were likely to be found innocent. The king thought these punishments would crush the spirit of Boston and scare the other 12 colonies into obedience. But his plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of being scared, the other colonies were outraged. They saw the punishment of Boston as an attack on all of them. If the king could do this to one colony, he could do it to any of them. So, instead of abandoning Boston, the other colonies rallied to its side, sent food, supplies, and money to help the people of the blockaded city. They realized that they were no longer 13 separate colonies, but one people with a common. Because they decided to hold a meeting, a Continental Congress, with representatives from every colony coming together to decide what to do next. The king's punishment had not divided them. It had united them. By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts was on the brink of war. The Patriots, also known as Minutemen because they had to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, had been secretly gathering weapons and ammunition. They stored a large supply of gunpowder, cannons, and muskets in the town of Concord, about 20 miles outside of Boston. The British general in Boston, Thomas Gage, learned about this secret stash of weapons. He also heard that 2 of the most important Patriot leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were hiding in the nearby town of Lexington. General Gage decided to send a secret mission of 700 redcoats to march out of Boston under the cover of night. Their orders were to march to Lexington, to capture Adams and Hancock, and then continue on to Concord to seize and destroy all the military supplies. But the Patriots had spies everywhere. They learned of the British plan. A silversmith and devoted son of liberty named Paul Revere organized a clever warning system. He knew the British would either march out by land over a narrow strip of neck, or they would cross the Charles River by boat. He arranged a secret signal. A friend would climb to the top of the old North Church steeple, the tallest point in Boston, and hang lanterns. 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea. If he hung 1 lantern, it meant the British were marching. He hung 2, it meant they were coming by boat, which was the faster route. On the night of April 18th, the signal came. 2 glowing lanterns appeared in the dark church tower. The British were coming by sea. Paul Revere and another rider named William Dawes leaped onto their horses and began their famous midnight ride. They galloped through the dark countryside, their horses' hooves thundering on the dirt roads. They rode to every village and farm, banging on doors and shouting the urgent warning, "The regulars are coming out. The regulars are coming out." Thanks to their bravery, by the time the British soldiers began their march, the entire countryside was awake and arming itself. The secret mission was no longer a secret. As the sun began to rise on the morning of April 19, 1775, the column of 700 British redcoats marched onto the town green of Lexington. Waiting for them was a small, determined group of about 70 colonial militiamen, led by Captain John Parker. They stood in 2 lines, their farm muskets in hand. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, not professional soldiers. They were vastly outnumbered. A British officer rode forward and shouted, "Lay down your arms, you villains, you!" Rebels. Captain Parker, seeing how hopeless the situation was, told his men, "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. No one knows for sure who fired first." From somewhere in the confusion from a British gun, or a colonial one, from a soldier in the line or a colonist hiding behind a walla, single shot rang out. That first fateful shot is now famously known as the shot heard round the world, because it started the American Revolution and inspired people all over the globe to fight for their own freedom. After that first shot, the British soldiers fired a volley into the militia. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen were dead and 10 were wounded. The militia scattered, and the British cheered. Thinking they had won an easy victory, they then marched on to Concord. But they were too late. Thanks to the warning, the colonists had moved most of the weapons and supplies. As the redcoats began their long march back to Boston, they found themselves in a nightmare. Hundreds, then thousands of Minutemen had gathered from all the surrounding towns. They hid behind trees, stone walls, and houses, firing at the column of British soldiers from all sides. The redcoats, trained to fight in open fields, were easy targets on the narrow road. The march back to Boston turned into a desperate retreat. By the time the British stumbled back into the city, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties. The war had begun. News of the battles at Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire throughout the 13 colonies. The time for talk was over. The time for action had come. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia, and they knew they needed to do 2 things immediately. First, they needed to officially form an army to fight the British. Second, that army needed a leader. The choice was a difficult one, but one man stood out from the rest. A tall, quiet, and respected delegate from Virginia named George Washington. George Washington was one of the most famous and experienced military men in the colonies. He had fought bravely for the British during the French and Indian War and had learned a great deal about military strategy and leadership. He was known for his calm demeanor, his commanding presence, and his unwavering sense of duty. When he was nominated to be the commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army, he humbly accepted. He even wore his old military uniform to the Congress to show that he was ready for the job. He refused to be paid a salary for his service, asking only that his expenses be covered. He knew the task ahead would be monumental. He had to take a ragtag group of volunteer farmers, merchants, and militiamen from 13 different colonies and turn them into a professional army capable of standing up to the most powerful military force on earth. His army had very little money, few cannons, not enough gunpowder, and soldiers who often didn't even have proper shoes, let alone uniforms. But what they did have was George Washington. And in him, they had a leader who possessed the one thing they needed most: their unbreakable will to win. He would become the heart and soul of the revolution, a symbol of American strength and perseverance through its darkest days. Even after the fighting started, many colonists still hoped they could make peace with Great Britain. They thought of themselves as Englishmen who were just fighting for their rights. But as the war dragged on and King George declared the colonies to be an open rebellion, more and more people began to believe that the only solution was to break away completely and form their own new country. A man named Thomas Paine wrote a powerful little pamphlet called Common Sense that became a bestseller. In simple, fiery language, he argued that it was crazy for a huge continent to be ruled by a tiny island across the sea, and that the time had come for America to declare its independence. The Continental Congress agreed. They formed a committee of 5 men to write a formal declaration. And the main author of this incredible document was a tall, red-headed, and brilliant young delegate from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. For 17 days, Jefferson sat at a small wooden desk and, with a quill pen, wrote the words that would change the world. He didn't just list the colonists' complaints against the king. He did something much more powerful, laid out a new vision for what a country should be. He began with the famous and beautiful words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was a revolutionary idea. He was saying that freedom wasn't a gift from a king. It was a right you were born with. On July 4th, 1776, after a few small changes, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock, the president of the Congress, signed his name first, writing it so large and bold that, as he said, King George could read it without his spectacles. The 13 colonies had officially declared to the world that they were no longer colonies. They were now, and forever would be, the free and independent United States of America. The winter of 1776 was a dark and desperate time for the American cause. General Washington's Continental Army had been defeated in a series of battles around New York City and had been chased across New Jersey. His soldiers were exhausted, freezing, and discouraged. Their enlistments were about to run out, and many were ready to give up and go home. The revolution was on the verge of collapse. Washington knew he needed a bold move, a dramatic victory to restore hope and turn the tide of the war. He came up with a daring and incredibly risky plan. Across the icy Delaware River, in the town of Trenton, New Jersey, was a garrison of 1,400 Hessian soldiers. The Hessians were professional German soldiers who were being paid by the British to fight in the war. Washington decided to launch a surprise attack on them. On Christmas night, in the middle of a raging winter storm with sleet and freezing rain, Washington gathered his 2,400 weary soldiers on the banks of the Delaware River. In large, heavy-bottomed boats, they began the treacherous crossing. The river was choked with huge chunks of floating ice that threatened to smash their boats. Wind howled and the snow fell, making it almost impossible to see. The crossing took all night, much longer than planned, but Washington refused to give up. Finally, in the cold gray dawn of the day after Christmas, they reached the other side. They marched 9 miles through the snow to Trenton. The Hessian soldiers, having celebrated Christmas the night before, were completely asleep and taken by surprise. The battle was short and decisive. The Continental Army captured nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers without losing a single man in combat. The victory at Trenton was a miracle. It was a shot of adrenaline for the American cause, boosting morale and proving that Washington's army could still fight and win. It was the Christmas present the revolution desperately needed. Despite the victory at Trenton, the war was far from over. The winter of 1777 to 1778 would prove to be one of the greatest tests of the entire Revolution. After a series of hard-fought battles, the British Army captured the American capital city of Philadelphia. General Washington led his tired and beaten army of 12,000 soldiers to a winter camp at a place called Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There were no warm buildings or comfortable houses waiting for them. There was only a cold, windy plateau. The winter at Valley Forge was a time of unimaginable hardship. The soldiers had to build their own log cabins in the freezing cold. Many of them had no proper uniforms, no coats, and no shoes, and were forced to wrap their feet in rags. The food supply was terrible. They often had to survive on a disgusting, bland porridge made of flour and water called fire cake. Disease swept through the crowded, unsanitary camp. Sicknesses like typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia were rampant. Over 2,000 soldiers died. That winter, not from battle, but from starvation, freezing cold, and disease. It seemed as though the Continental Army might just melt away. But through it all, George Washington stayed with his men. He shared their hardships. He lobbied Congress desperately for more supplies. And his sheer determination and presence held the army together. And then, a bit of luck arrived in the form of a Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben. He didn't speak much English, but he knew how to train soldiers. All winter long, he drilled the American troops relentlessly, teaching them how to march in formation, how to use their bayonets, how to fight like a professional European army. By the time spring arrived and the army marched out of Valley Forge, they were a different force. They were fewer in number, but they were tougher, more disciplined, and more unified than ever before. They had survived the worst, and they were now a true fighting army. From the very beginning of the war, American leaders like Benjamin Franklin knew they couldn't win against the mighty British Empire all by themselves. They needed a powerful friend, a strong ally, to help them with money, supplies, and most importantly, a navy. The most logical choice was France. France had been Great Britain's biggest rival for centuries, and they were still bitter about losing the French in the Indian War. They would love a chance to get revenge and weaken the British Empire. Benjamin Franklin, a world-famous scientist and diplomat, was sent to Paris to try and convince the French King Louis XVI to join the American cause. At first, the French were hesitant. They liked the idea of helping the Americans, but they didn't want to bet on a losing horse. They waited to see if the colonists could prove they actually had a chance of winning. That proof came in October 1777 with the stunning American victory. At the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York, an entire British army was forced to surrender. When news of this incredible victory reached Paris, the French were convinced. In 1778, France officially signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. This alliance was a complete game-changer. France sent soldiers, weapons, and most crucially, their powerful navy to help the Americans. The war was no longer just a colonial rebellion. It was now a world war. A brave and enthusiastic young French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, was so inspired by the American fight for liberty that he had already volunteered to serve, becoming one of George Washington's most trusted and beloved generals. The arrival of French help gave the Americans new resources and new hope. A powerful friend fighting on their side, victory now seemed not just possible, but probable. By 1781, the war had been raging for 6 long years. The main British army in the South was led by a general named Lord Charles Cornwallis. After a series of battles in North and South Carolina, Cornwallis marched his tired army of 7,500 soldiers into Virginia. He chose to set up his base at a small port town on a peninsula called Yorktown. He thought it was a safe spot because he could be resupplied and protected by the powerful British Navy from the sea. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. George Washington saw a golden opportunity. He and his French allies, led by General Rochambeau, came up with a brilliant and complicated plan. Washington pretended he was going to attack the main British army in New York City. He set up fake camps and sent fake messages to trick the British commander there. While the British were focused on New York, Washington, and Rochambeau took the bulk of their combined American and French armies and began a secret, rapid march more than 400 miles south to Virginia. At the same time, the French Navy, under the command of Admiral de Grasse, sailed up from the Caribbean and blockaded the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. When the British Navy arrived to help Cornwallis, they were met by the French fleet and were defeated in a major naval battle. Cornwallis was trapped. The French Navy blocked his escape by sea, and the combined American and French armies, now numbering almost 17,000 men, surrounded him on land. For 3 weeks, they bombarded Yorktown with cannon fire day and night. With no hope of escape and his army crumbling, Lord Cornwallis had no choice. On October 19, 1781, he officially surrendered his entire army. As the British soldiers marched out to lay down their weapons, a British military band played a sad tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." And for the British Empire, it truly had. The surrender at Yorktown was the last major battle of the American Revolution. When news reached London, the British Parliament knew the war was lost. It was too expensive and too difficult to continue fighting. They voted to end the war and begin peace negotiations. American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, traveled to Paris, France, to work out the details of the peace treaty in 1783. They signed the Treaty of Paris. In this treaty, Great Britain officially recognized the United States of America as a free and independent country. They also agreed on the new nation's borders, which would stretch from the Atlantic Ocean in the east all the way to the Mississippi River in the west. The long and bloody war was finally officially over. The American people had done the impossible. A small group of colonies had stood up to the most powerful empire on earth and had won their freedom. But now they faced a new and equally difficult challenge. What kind of country were they going to be? Their first attempt at a government, called the Articles of Confederation, was too weak. The states argued with each other, and the national government had no power to solve their problems. It became clear they needed a new, stronger set of rules. So, in 1787, leaders from all the states gathered once again in Philadelphia. Their job was to create a new plan for their government, a plan that would be strong enough to hold the country together, but that would also protect the rights and liberties they had just fought so hard to win. This new plan would be called the Constitution of the United States. The creation of the Constitution was a masterpiece of compromise and brilliant thinking. The leaders, now called the Founding Fathers, designed a government with 3 separate branches: the Legislative Congress, the Executive, the President, and the Judicial, the Supreme Court, each with its own powers to check and balance the others, ensuring that no one part could become too powerful. They created a system where the people could elect their own leaders. After much debate, the new Constitution was approved by the states. The United States of America now had its official rulebook. All that was left was to choose the nation's first leader. Choice was obvious and unanimous. The one man who had held the country together through the darkest days of the war, the hero of the Revolution, was George Washington. In 1789, he was elected as the first president of the United States. He reluctantly left his quiet farm in Virginia to lead the new nation he had helped to create. The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was the beginning of a great experiment. It was a test of a powerful idea, that ordinary people had the right to govern themselves, to choose their own leaders, and to live in freedom. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with sacrifice and courage, but in the end, the 13 little colonies had become one great nation, a beacon of liberty and a symbol of hope for people all over the world. And that is the amazing, adventurous, and true story of how the United States of America was born.